even a full week into the off season of the college basketball, and we may have one of the craziest starts that we've ever had, and maybe the craziest coaching carousel we've ever seen. And I thought I was going to get a few weeks off. I'm not going to. So let's get into this. Welcome all into the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. And yes, Pepperdine has hired a new head coach. Yes, Washington State has hired a new head coach. And I will kind of recap that a little bit, considering they both happened right after I released the last episode. But I've got to start with, there is a connection here, and I will get to the WCC connection, that the biggest job in all of college basketball was vacated and filled all within a few days, and that is the Kentucky job, which was filled by John Calipari, who has left for Arkansas, has now been filled by a familiar name for many, and really every WCC fan should be familiar with. It's not Dan Hurley, who turned it down. It's not Nate Oates, who said pass. It's not Scott Drew, who also said God called for him to be in Waco. No, it was someone who used to coach in the conference. Maybe the least expected of the names to actually get this job. The new head coach at Kentucky for the Wildcats is none other than now former BYU head coach Mark Pope. And this is the wildest coaching carousel, the wildest just up and down coaching selection I can remember in a long time, because this all happened so fast. This all had so many different names attached to it because it's the Kentucky job. And regardless of what anyone says, is obviously like that is the bluest of blood teams in college basketball. They have the pedigree, they have the budget, they have everything that you would want from a program. But I mean, it does. But as we've seen in the last few days, we've seen coaches say, I'm good where I am. I don't need to go anywhere. I have everything I could need right where I am. And almost every last one of these made sense of why it was a no. I mean, we've seen it over the last few years of just how more or less Big Blue Nation has chased John Calipari out and almost forced him into the arms of Arkansas. Dan Hurley's coming off back-to-back national championships, maybe one of the best runs we've ever seen from a single program. Why would he go anywhere? Scott Drew built the Baylor program. He won a national championship just a few years ago against Gonzaga. He has built that thing up from the ground up and can do no wrong. He will never have to buy another meal in Waco ever again. Why would he go anywhere? Nate Oates is still building that Alabama program, but that he has made Alabama basketball relevant. And being in the same conference as Kentucky, being as successful as he has been, he got that team to the Final Four this year. Why would you go anywhere? Because you know you have all the resources you could want at Alabama. Why would you go anywhere? Then there was a talk of Billy Donovan, who's still obviously coaching for the Bulls. Then I threw out what would have been the craziest of ones, which would have been Rick Pitino. Chris Beard could have been an option. There were a lot of high-profile, maybe edgier names before you ever get to Mark Pope. And it's not like that I'm saying that Mark Pope is a bad option, because Mark Pope is a good coach. Let's not get that twisted in any sort of way. He may be the right option there. My my critique about that hire is going to be whether or not Kentucky, that fan base, that administration is going to have the patience to wait, the patience to say this may take a few years before this is going to get going. I mean, the other thing is, again, and it's fair to critique this, is that Mark Pope, I think, again, has done really well. He's been to the NCAA tournament. I believe it's 3 or 4 times in his tenure, both as the BYU head coach and then also Utah Valley. But he hasn't won a tournament game. Didn't win one at BYU. He did not win one this past year. In the first year in the Big 12, they were 23-11 this year, 10-8. They were tied for 5th in the Big 12. Got a 6th seed, and we kind of talked about that 5-6 seed flip flop that they had with Gonzaga. They lost to Duquesne, but also, again, they finished 5th in the Big 12 after finishing 5th in back-to-back years in the WCC. So this is, I am fascinated. I'm fascinated to see what this all turns into for Kentucky, for Mark Pope, and then for where BYU goes from there. And the Kentucky situation with Mark Pope does have value going into next year for one particular WCC team, because as of right now, Gonzaga is slated to play Kentucky in Seattle this coming season. Now, new head coach, not the same head coach that signed the deal and whatnot, and obviously there was a lot of talk that, how long will Calipari actually be at Kentucky through the course of this deal? Will he ever actually play in the kennel? And it turns out he may not ever have to play in the kennel after all, because he bounced for Arkansas, because that game at the kennel between Kentucky and the Zags was going to be the final year of that 6-year deal. We're only into year 3 going into this coming season. And so Mark Pope will likely have to see the Zags again. He did not fare well against the Zags really at all in his tenure at BYU. 1-8 against them in the period that they were still in the WCC. So a wild start to the college basketball offseason. It feels like this is maybe going to calm down a bit because the biggest job is now off the board. And yes, like there were some other dominoes that had fallen to kind of make this scenario be even a possibility. But it's not over. What happens with BYU? What happens in the aftermath of whoever BYU ends up picking up and where they leave from? I saw, at least like I've seen like one name that obviously that's popped up has been Mark Madsen. And if Mark Madsen were to take that job and leave Cal, that opens up the Cal job. And then how enticing is maybe that Cal job for another coach likely on the West Coast, or maybe actually considering they're joining the ACC and East Coast option. But again, all that's neither here or there. There's got a lot of moving parts, a lot of dominoes still to fall, but a familiar name ends up at Kentucky as their new head coach, Mark Pope, and the Zags will get a very early crack at the new look Wildcats come next season. So yeah, so there were 2 in-conference coaching hires, which we definitely need to talk about, and we're going to start with Washington State and David Riley. Wasn't long after like I released the last episode, and then within 5 hours there was a hire. And David Riley, who is the 20th head coach for the Cougars, spent the last 3 seasons as the head coach for Eastern Washington. He was the back-to-back Big Sky Coach of the Year, back-to-back regular season champions as well the last 2 years. He has a 6-year deal with Washington State, which I think obviously is a good thing kind of as they head into whatever it's going to look like after their 2-year stint with the WCC. But a total of 13 years at Eastern Washington. He was an assistant under Shante Leggins from 17 to 21. He is the fourth youngest Division I head coach in college basketball, 35 years old, and he's got a lot of work to do. 9 transfers out at this point. His name had been linked to the Pepperdine job earlier in the process before Washington State opened up. He talked a lot about how Washington State was his dream job. He's a Eastern Washington kid. He spent time, his college years were in Spokane or in the Spokane area. So this is a guy who is very, very familiar with the Pacific Northwest, with that Eastern Washington area. And this is a young, exciting hire, I think, for Washington State. I don't know if this is necessarily where they would have gone had the Pac-12 still been in existence. But this I think gives a fair amount of excitement into what we could be looking at in the WCC. Yes, like I would have liked to have seen Kyle Smith stay put and really kind of like add to that mix of a lot of veteran coaches in the WCC. But we're going to get an influx of youth with David Riley. He will be the youngest coach in the WCC. But I think it's going to be really exciting to kind of see he now start to develop that program, but then probably really develop that rivalry, a legitimate in-conference rivalry with Gonzaga just down the road in Spokane. This is going to be, I think, really fun to watch. There's a lot of excitement out of Washington State about this one. Nothing but great things that have been said out of Eastern Washington about Riley coming in. So this will be a fascinating hire to see how this really starts to shape out for the Cougars. The other hire, down in Malibu, Pepperdine hired Ed Schilling, who's been a longtime assistant and player development coach in college basketball. Most recently, he had been at Grand Canyon. So a guy who's familiar with WCC opponents. He'd helped them to the 3 NCAA tournament appearances, 2 WAC regular season titles. Obviously, they got their first NCAA tournament win just a few weeks ago by beating St. Mary's. But even thinking about looking at what other teams, they've seen USF. They played Gonzaga last year in the tournament. They played Pepperdine, LMU. Like they have played Portland. They have played a good chunk of the WCC roster as it is. And so Ed Schilling brings a lot of experience against WCC opponents, against those coaching staffs, to kind of know what the profile of the WCC is and what is potential at Pepperdine. Because obviously we all saw what Pepperdine was capable of bringing in with Lorenzo Romar at the helm, a lot of big-time talent. And again, you're bringing in a guy who is a player who has spent a good chunk of his career as focused on player development. And that is what I think is going to be required at Pepperdine, is just the development of younger players who are going to stick around. And I know like the portal has made that very challenging. And just the way that guys want to move up programs and that sort of thing. But Pepperdine, I think, does present a unique opportunity because we've seen that talent can be brought there. But what we did not see was it get put all together in the right way. And that is going to be the challenge, as I talked about it in the last episode. This is going to be, I think, it's not as challenging as the Pacific job, which I still think is the hardest one in the WCC. But there's a tough hill to climb here. And consistency and that growth are going to be the keys for the Waves. And in addition to the Grand Canyon success that Ed Schilling has had, he was with UCLA in the 2010s, where they had 3 Sweet 16 appearances. He spent time at Memphis, spent time at Indiana. So this is a guy who knows what big programs look like, knows what it takes to succeed in these bigger environments. And with Pepperdine upgrading its facilities in the near future, this is a pretty exciting window for Pepperdine to kind of see what is going to be happening moving forward. Now, it's not all like a lot of incomers. So we had talked about David Riley, we talked about Ed Schilling, like guys who are coming in. But we still have guys making their exits, and a couple of role players that are kind of making their departures. Justin Beaker, who is a grad transfer out of USF, he has hit the transfer portal. St. Mary's also loses Chris Howell, which isn't really a big surprise. There was going to be a lot of competition in that backcourt with Marshallonis Mahaney, Jordan Ross, and then also the return from injury of Rory Hawk. So I didn't think there was going to be a whole lot of minutes. So to me, this wasn't a huge surprise seeing him at the portal. But the biggest player movement of the last week really came on, I believe it was Tuesday, and that was the departure of Mike Sharovjam's Mongolian Mike, who has hit the transfer portal. Now, he has left the option open that he could potentially return to USF, but if he doesn't, this is an interesting case because he averaged a little over 7.5 points a game, 2.7 assists, 6'8" guard, and this is the one thing there was so much hype about him coming over from Dayton, and you could see the tools, and I held my reservation about what he could be because I wanted to see it before I believed it. And we got a full season to see. And the fact is, it really didn't live up to the hype. And that was one of the challenges for Sharovjam's in this season, was that we saw guys around him develop quickly. We saw guys like Marcus Williams really start to kind of take over and take control. We saw Jonathan Mobo do the same. We got to see it from a number of guys on that USF squad, but we did not see that from Mongolian Mike. We saw glimpses. We saw small moments of how he could take over a game. He was bigger than almost anyone who guarded him. He could shoot over anybody who picked up his assignment. And yet we didn't see that aggressiveness. We didn't see enough, in my opinion, that led me to believe that he obviously allowed this past year not to take that next step. And I think that's what is missing. It's like he needs to have that fire. He needs to have that aggressiveness. He needs to know that he can take control of a game because he clearly has the tools. We have not seen him be able to put it all together. And he's going to take a look at the portal. He's going to take a look at what might be available to him. If he does come back, I think it will still be a great fit for it'll be a great fit for USF for him to come back. But if he doesn't come back, I think it gives them a lot of opportunity to find someone to fill that role, to be really to be kind of like the playmaker and be the point guard of this squad. Because I think even with Marcus Williams, like Marcus Williams to me is a better scorer than he is a point guard. Like he's more of like a 1 and a 2, a 2 and a 1's body than he is a 1. And that's where so there is some space here. If Mike comes back he starts to show the real potential I think he's all capable of, USF could be really good next year. But if he's not, there's plenty of room in the portal that they can try to find another option to fit what USF does need, and they need someone who can take over late in games. So another big departure, and arguably this is the biggest departure to this point, and this might be saying something considering who also left the squad. St. Mary's also lost another as well, but this time from the coaching staff. Associate head coach Justin Joyner got the call and will now be heading to Michigan to join Dusty May's staff there in Ann Arbor. Joyner had spent the last 7 seasons with St. Mary's, helped the team to 3 straight 5 seeds, obviously 2 different NCAA tournament victories in that period. He helped develop back-to-back Defensive Player of the Years, also helping with the guard development on this squad. Marshallonis, Tommy Kuzi come to mind. And then he was incredibly critical on the recruitment front. You look at St. Mary's bringing in the best recruiting class that they've ever had, Mikey Lewis and Zion Sensley coming in this year. I've seen some kind of compare this to an extent to that of Tommy Lloyd leaving Gonzaga. And while I don't know if I want to completely go to that extent, this is someone who has been really critical of, and a critical part of the success that the Gales have had for the last few years, especially as you've seen this team redefine itself as being a defensive first team. And that all started in 2019. We saw that switch going into the latter half of WCC play. We saw that as they went into the pandemic. Yes, they got banged up, but as they came out of it, the Logan Johnson, Kyle Bowen anchored defenses that got them the first 2 5 seeds, and then Mitchell Saxon, who then kind of added on to that this past year. Alex Dukas being a part of that. Augustus Marshallonis being a part of that. Josh Jefferson being a part of that. You just look at just the success that this team has had in the window in which Justin Joyner was at St. Mary's. And he's also one of the nicest guys around. For me, it's sad to see him go. He will be missed in Moraga, but this is a move. Like, it stinks as a St. Mary's fan, but I'm happy for him. It's an amazing opportunity. He's a guy who I don't think it's going to be very long before he's a head coach somewhere else down the road, whether that's back out here on the West Coast or he kind of finds that role out in the Midwest as he grows with that Michigan staff. But a huge blow for St. Mary's, huge get for Michigan, and this is just the continued carousel that we're seeing. So we'll see what happens as far as St. Mary's trying to refill the coaching staff there. Mickey McConnell is still on the staff, so might see something along the lines of Joe Rahan, obviously one of the former St. Mary's guards who has been on the coaching staff. He might move up, but we'll see which direction Randy Bennett goes on that front. And so a lot of departures, but the other departures, not necessarily departures, are also now, we have some players that are starting to declare for the draft and really kind of see what it's going to look like for them. And a few of the guys that have already declared, Jonathan Mobo was the first one from USF. Michael Ajayi, Adama Ball also both declared for the draft. No surprise really for any of these 3. Maybe a little bit. I was actually surprised that Ajayi declared, but all 3 declared with room to return to their schools. And it's going to be, and obviously for each of them, it's going to be really valuable for them to kind of see what the NBA scouts are going to tell them about what they need to do to improve upon returning to college, because none of them, Adama Ball is maybe the one who has the best shot at getting drafted of that initial group. And he may go and he may get some feedback that, hey, he might actually be moving up some draft boards. I mean, we've seen that from Santa Clara guards over the last couple of years. Pajemski really shot up through the draft process. We saw the same thing with Jalen Williams. Now, I don't think that Ball will kind of rise at the same rate that either of them will, but he is we saw just like the glimpses of how incredibly talented he was and how he could take over games late when he was healthy. And I think that was the problem late in the year. He got derailed he got derailed by injury. He wasn't quite right when he got back initially. He started to look a little bit better in the WCC tournament, but he didn't get enough of that run back up to kind of like see what he would have been capable of doing. So I think he's going to get some valuable feedback. Ajayi's going to get some valuable feedback. Mobo is going to get some valuable feedback. I expect all three of them to be back next year. Mobo, I think he's going to get told, I think kind of what we saw against some of the better teams is don't shy away when you face someone bigger or when that happens, because he disappeared at times against Gonzaga, against St. Mary's. And guess what? It's not going to get easier at the NBA level. Those are the guys you're going to have to see. Those are the skill level guys, the strength level guys you're going to see. You better be ready to push back. You better be ready to fight back. So I think that's at least partly some of the feedback he's going to get. And also probably you better start learning to shoot from the 3-point line, because you're going to have to do it at the next level. At least be competent at the 3-point line from for at least maybe like even from the elbow out. Ajayi might just be a little bit more of like the toning of the skills, like just honing those abilities he already has. And I think what maybe more so like show it on the defensive end. We know he can rebound well. We know that. Do it consistently on the defensive end, because you can't be a defensive liability, and more or less everyone in Pepperdine was a defensive liability last year. So a number of guys, I expect some more. We obviously know Anton Watson his eligibility has run out, so he'll be part of the draft process. He is one I think is going to be fascinating to watch and kind of see where he falls, what the rising on him. And we'll talk more about the NBA draft as we get a little bit deeper into the process, get into May, get into June as we get closer to the draft time. I expect a few others to also hit the portal, hit the draft declaration as well. Javon Porter, Graham Ike, Ryan Emmert. I expect all of them to also go test and see what they're going to get the feedback from the pro scouts. And as wrapping up, definitely nothing to look into any of these, because it's always the habit to have the way too early rank top 25 ranks going into next year. But I mean, the great initial returns for both St. Mary's and for Gonzaga. Gonzaga, by almost every publication, has them in the top 10, most of which have them in the top 5. Both The Athletic and ESPN had them at number 2, which is a wild place to see them. But again, with knowing that they likely have 4 of their starters returning, they bring in Michael Ajayi. You hope to have a healthy Steel Venters. They haven't had any real movement on the portal yet, so that's also a good thing for them at this point. It looks good initially for Gonzaga, and it looks like that they are going to be right back in that title hunt almost a year after a lot of people thought that the window might be closed and that the program, their chance at that title, Mark Few's chance at that title, were dead and buried. Not so dead, not so buried as it seems. And for St. Mary's, losing Josh Jefferson didn't move the needle all that much. Or maybe it did, and this might actually say something to where they are, because they were ranging anywhere between 13 and 17. I think the lowest I saw was 19. But a top 20 team going into next year is what St. Mary's is looking like initially. The Field of 68 had them at 13, ESPN 16, Fox Sports had them at 17. So again, like they're kind of like all ballparking in that mid-teen range for St. Mary's going into next year. And you bring back Augustus Marciulionis, you bring back Aiden Mahaney, you bring back Mitchell Saxon, who made the call that he will be returning. Luke Barrett made his call that he will be returning. And despite a couple of the losses, you bring in your best recruiting class ever. This is a St. Mary's team that does look like it's on paper still trending upward and still trending in that way. And at least with a little bit more of the continuity in the backcourt with Marshallonis, I'd expect the St. Mary's team to hit the ground running a little easier than they did this past year, where it took them almost a month and a half to find their footing. So good early returns for both those squads. Maybe a little higher than I thought for both of them, but it's also, these are probably two of the teams that actually they know what their rosters are going to look like largely going into the year. For so many of these other teams where they've had, it's like, oh, Duke's going to be here and Kentucky's going to be here and they're going to be here, they're going to be here. A lot of these teams still are missing their rosters in significant parts of their rosters because of the portal. So I'm not going to read too much into any of these rankings, nor should really anybody else. If anything, it's just a sign of respect that the national media has, not only for Gonzaga, and they've long, I think, had that respect for Gonzaga, but now also for St. Mary's going into the offseason and going into the 24-25 year. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Like the podcast on your favorite streaming services. Follow follow on social media at Post by Zach, and now also the new Instagram account for the podcast at unofficial WCC pod. All right, well, that'll do it. Have a great week, everybody. This has been a crazy start to the off season. I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. So check back in. We'll definitely be covering as much as we possibly can throughout the course of the off season. So that'll do it. Have a great week, and I will catch you later.